Welcome to today's webinar on challenges to unions and workers in the age of COVID-19, views from the Global South. This webinar is hosted by the School of Industrial and Labor Relations. I'm Alex Colvin, the Dean of the school. We're also hosting in collaboration with our own Worker Institute, as well as the Solidarity Center. The webinar today is going to be looking at some of the major challenges facing unions and workers in the age of COVID-19. Some have talked about this as the first major event that's affecting workers on a global basis simultaneously. Obviously here in the United States, we're particularly experiencing severe effects from the pandemic, but across the world, workers in every country are being affected by this. This is a truly global crisis that we are facing. And so what we want to do today is take advantage of the abilities brought to us by modern technology and have a global discussion about the challenges we're facing around the world. And we want to particularly focus today on the challenges faced in the Global South, which is often not given enough attention in thinking about the challenges that this is facing for workers and the responses to it. We have a very distinguished panel today that is going to be commenting on these issues. I'm going to introduce us in a second, but I first want to thank the people who have behind the scenes put together the event today. I want to thank our technical team, D.H. Goodall, Alison Dunchick, David Lane, who have been working hard to put this together. I think one of the things that we've learned in this pandemic is the value of many workers behind the scenes who we don't often pay attention to, who make things continue to run in difficult times. I want to thank Dina Bashar, my colleague here at ILR, for her work organizing this, and Al Davidoff of the Solidarity Center, who's also put a lot of work in organizing this event today. Our first speaker is going to be Shawna Bader-Blau, who's the Executive Director of the Solidarity Center, the largest US-based global worker rights organization. We're also going to hear from Zingiswa Losi, President of the Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU, the major union federation in South Africa, who's also a member of the African National Congress Party. And Kalpona Akter, President of the Bangladesh Garment and Industrial Workers Federation, who's also the founder and executive director of the Bangladesh Center for Worker Solidarity. This is a wonderful panel representing perspectives from around the globe, and I really appreciate them joining us from different time zones. I realize this is always a challenge when we organize these global panels, so I particularly appreciate that we're hearing from people in the morning, in the afternoon, and the evening around the world. So I'm going to ask each of them to make some comments in turn, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. In the Zoom webinar format, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, so you can put in questions that we'll be able to pose to our panel later in the webinar session. So do use the Q&A function as we're going along. So I'm going to start with Shawna Bader-Blau. Shawna, would you like to kick us off, please?
Good morning. Thank you. Good afternoon. Good evening. Thank you so much to Cornell for hosting us today. And just before I get started, I just want to acknowledge and thank all the workers behind the scenes running our country, running New York. Acknowledge the more than 70,000 Americans who have passed away already due to this crisis, and the millions of people affected, and especially acknowledge my brothers and sisters who are joining us from New York, which has been at the heart of the crisis here. And thank you for what you've done to help our whole country learn more about how to fight this and how to stand up for working class people. Thank you to Cornell for always bringing workers to the fore. I'm also really honored today to join you with my sisters Kalpona and President Losi. I'm looking forward to hearing their remarks as well. You know, more than 4 out of 5 people on Earth, workers around the world, are out of their jobs due to social distancing orders around the world. 81% of the global workforce. More than 400 million jobs have already been lost in the Global South alone. This is leading to devastating rises not only in unemployment, but poverty and hunger. And the real true devastating effects of this time won't be known for some months, but we feel them talking to workers around the world in Latin America, Asia, Africa, across Europe, all across the Middle East and North Africa every single day. So the most prominent feature of this crisis is a rise in insecurity for the most vulnerable people on earth. But we as Solidarity Center have also been tracking, in conversation with workers in more than 60 countries where we work, we've been tracking 5 major trends that we see rising up that really are affecting the global working class disproportionately. And I want to share a little bit about those today. First, for decades, our global employers and governments have been encouraging flexibilization of the workforce. That has included a large increase in contract work, day labor, and informal work in general. In addition, in most of the global South, informal employment has always been the majority of employment for people around the world, especially women. But what we are seeing right now in this pandemic is that this informality, informal employment, agriculture, contract and day labor, gig employment, is imperiling workers. These are exactly the workers who are not registered for social protections when governments around the world, 55% of African governments, 45% of governments across Asia and Latin America are extending income support. It is the informal workforce that is not benefiting from this income support. When our countries are widening testing and resources, health resources for workers and for communities, the informal workforce that is not registered as employees around the world are being left out. The virus is imperiling informal workers, and the steps we are taking as governments and societies to defend and shore up our workforces are not reaching these most vulnerable people. This is 60% of global employment, and it includes tens of millions of migrant workers who are working contingently all around the world and are not being covered. The next major trend that we are tracking is the potential catastrophic effect that this pandemic and the response can have on the fundamental institutions of the working class, and that is the trade union movement. Trade unions are the indispensable fundamental representatives of workers and speak up for us. They are our global working class institutions. And through job loss and massive unemployment, as well as a rising new trend of opportunistic union busting, we are seeing a potential global working class and its institutions being devastated by this crisis. So we are really worried about the ability of the trade union movement and its institutions, embattled as they are around the world, to make it through this moment. The next major trend that we are tracking, and our sister Kalpona has a deep amount of expertise in this area, and so I will definitely defer to my sister on this area, but supply chain workers. The workers around the world who make the least amount of money producing electronics, clothing, food for all of us in global supply chains are the most vulnerable right now, and they are losing and shedding jobs by the tens of thousands in every single one of our countries. If I'm a lead firm company headquartered somewhere in Europe or the United States and I make jeans, right now nobody's buying jeans, nobody's going to the store, nobody has disposable income. So what do? Well, I don't need that factory in Bangladesh. I don't need that supplier in Cambodia. And these workers are losing jobs as a result. And they are living in conditions where on a good day, they're making just a couple $100s a month. This pandemic is exposing a truly decrepit and unfortunate disproportionate effect on supply chain workers, because the way we have organized global supply chains keeps the workers that are producing for the global economy the most vulnerable. And so they are shedding jobs by the tens of thousands. In addition, our brothers and sisters around the world who are supply chain union activists tell us about how even before this crisis, but even through the crisis, as factories start to reopen, as governments start to claim factory employment and also agricultural work as essential employment, people are coming back into jobs with no health and safety protections and very often with limited sanitation. My brothers and sisters in the proud country of Lesotho, surrounded by South Africa, just 2 weeks ago told us about exactly that phenomenon. Workers in factories producing clothing for export to major global markets, working without running water or soap in plants. This is a tragedy. The next major trend that we are tracking is the very, very clear and painful gendered impact of both the pandemic as well as our global collective response. We have, of course, women are the majority of workers in travel, tourism, restaurants, food production, healthcare. Frontline workers are women. We're also the majority of the informal sector and half of all global migrants. Women in the workforce are bearing the brunt of this pandemic. They're also continue around the world to receive unequal pay. Women in every single country across every sector are disproportionately underpaid at the rate of 70 cents to every man's dollar. And in addition, right now, we see a rise of violence in countries around the world, including just recently in Mexico, of healthcare workers, predominantly women, being wearing masks and going into work, communities taking out their frustration on these healthcare workers. They're experiencing a rise in violence. And we know that around the world, we have a rise of domestic violence under lockdown. And when workers go back into the workplace, the effects of domestic violence on workers in the workplace will become very real and shows us exactly why we need to stand up for women workers around the world right now. But this can also be said about a disproportionate impact on the poorest workers. So there's a class impact and racial impact. We know in the United States that people of color are disproportionately being affected and dying in this crisis, and also our frontline workers in this crisis. So gendered impact as well as racial and class disproportionate impact. And finally, very frustratingly, around the world, we are tracking a fifth trend, which is the pandemic response is boosting authoritarianism. 84 countries around the world have declared emergency declarations that are suspending civil liberties and civil rights. 30 countries are enacting broad sweeping reductions on freedom of speech. 111 countries are restricting the right to assemble. And yes, we don't want a lot of big assemblies in a COVID crisis, but this extends to things like you have a stay-at-home order in the country, but you're sending essential workers into an unsafe factory. So they're allowed to work in unsafe factory conditions, but they can't go outside to have a rally or to protest, or else they're breaking the law. This rise in authoritarian response. We also have 27 countries vastly expanding curtailments on the right to privacy in this moment. You know, there was a moment in Kenya a couple of weeks ago where more people died being shot by police for trying to, for not obeying social distancing orders than had died from the virus. This is a really strong concern around the world. But I gotta say, those are dark trends and we need to track them. But why do we need to track them? Because we're the labor movement. Because in the labor movement, you know, this is what we were made for. We were made to stand up to exactly this kind of crisis. We were born for this exact kind of moment. And we know around the world that unions and worker associations that stand up for workers are standing up now as well, despite the rise in authoritarianism, despite the opportunistic union busting and all of these issues. We see unions in places like North Africa, in Tunisia, the Tunisian labor movement that brought democracy to that country and stands up for women's rights and migrant rights and democracy in that country, negotiating with the state fully paid wages for months in the private sector so that people, even under stay-at-home orders, continue to get their salaries. They negotiated these benefits, and my sister in South Africa has also led major efforts to make sure private and public sector workers are maintaining salaries in this moment. We have powerful union brothers and sisters making those kinds of gains. We saw in Ukraine, unions winning wage increases of 300% for frontline medical workers, majority of whom are women. And in Albania, unions winning 4-hour workdays for essential workers so that essential workers are employed but are not being exposed 8 and 12 hours a day to sickness. Unions in Kyrgyzstan and Ethiopia converting buildings that they own into field hospitals and quarantine centers. And some of the poorest workers on earth, unions in really low-wage sectors in Sri Lanka, using the resources they have to distribute food and supplies to even poorer workers in the informal economy. And all around the world, women from Bangladesh to South Africa to all in 25 countries where we have presence and program, we are monitoring a huge, powerful, resurgent women's movement, women leadership in the labor movement right now, calling out gender inequality, violence against women, and demanding our governments ratify the latest new ILO convention, C-190, to protect us all against violence and harassment in the world of work. You know, this is the kind of moment the labor movement was born for. And so when you look at these 5 trends that we are monitoring, if you flip them on their head, you get a powerful vision for the future. And that's where we need to go now as a global labor movement. Yes, informal workers now are disproportionately being left out, falling through the cracks. But in the future, no more of this informality, meaning no rights, meaning no healthcare coverage, meaning no social protections. All work has dignity. All workers have value. Coming out of this crisis, let's flip that trend on its head and make that part of our fight. Yes, unions are imperiled and embattled, and we are worried about the fundamental institutions of the working class coming out of this crisis strong. But why are we so embattled and weakened? We need to come out as a labor movement with a new commitment to powerful union organizing, to cross-border grassroots internationalism, and we need to come together as a union movement to demand an end to union busting and an end to authoritarian anti-unionism, because it is the labor movement that protects workers in a moment of a pandemic crisis, and we need strong institutions of the working class. When we're talking about supply chain workers, we will hear from my sister Kalpona a lot of ways that supply chain workers are fighting back right now and making gains and protecting wages. We need to come out of this with a renewed commitment to understand that lead firms and big global corporations have way too much power when it comes to deciding wages, working conditions, health and safety, and gender disparities in supply chain workforces. It's unacceptable. We don't need to go back to the status quo of how supply chains were functioning. We need to reimagine something different. And the same is true on the gendered, disproportionate gender and other equality issues, migrant workers, the racism that is underpinning so many of our societies. We need to come out of this with a commitment, a renewed commitment as a labor movement to bring full equality in our working class institutions so that women's voices are heard, that migrant workers are heard, and in our societies. We need to be committed to that. And finally, and I'll end with this, the labor movement for 100 years has been fighting for more equality and more democracy for workers. We are the fundamental institutions of the working class and of societies that bring about a vision of economic justice and political fairness. And right now, this rise in authoritarianism, we need to push back on that. We need to reclaim our own democracies for the working class, for working people. And that means we need to fight for and win, not only open political environments for people, but more powerfully than that, a new social contract. We need universal access to healthcare and free universal healthcare for all. We need living wages, not minimum wages, not no wage minimums. We need to fight for resilient workforces with living wages for all. We need to fight for true equality between workers, health and safety as a guaranteed human right. And we need to make sure that everyone has pensions and salary protections should we ever face a crisis like this again, but because we deserve it and we've earned it. And that is our challenge going forward. Let's turn this crisis on its head, and let's turn this moment into a time to rejuvenate our societies, and the working class institutions can lead it. Thank you.
Thank you. So obviously some very dark trends, but some inspiring thoughts there. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to turn to President Losi to give her perspective.
Thank you very much, Alex, and greetings to everyone. I'm going to give the perspective in relation to in the South African context. And I want to agree with all the issues that Shawna have raised pertaining to the challenges, but also the opportunities that are in front of us. In the South African context, the challenges that are confronting us are two issues. One is to save the jobs and is to save the lives. And we think that and we believe that both are equally important and neither of the two can be compromised. And we want also to address where we were as South Africa before the COVID-19 lockdown and what workers have had to endure. You would understand that before the COVID-19, we had an economic recession already when we got into the lockdown. We had 40% of unemployment in our country, the collapse of the state-owned companies. We had wage suppression, rising levels of corruption, and also the collapse of the public sector. And now, currently, what we are faced with are no different from the pre-COVID-19 lockdown, but I think things have been exacerbated. We have the unprecedented economic depression. You would know that the rating agencies have further downgraded South African economy to a junk status, and we have mass retrenchments. Other employers are not necessarily taking advantage of the lockdown. They are not coming forth and presenting Section 189 of retrenchments to the trade union movements. But what we have realized is that as we interface and interact with the Ministry of Employment and Labor, we have realized that the number of claims arising in relation to the Unemployment Insurance Fund outside the COVID Relief Fund, and that is as a result of employers that are closing down workplaces and retrenching workers without the necessary processes that are in the Labor Relations Act. And also what we are faced with is the huge collapse of some sectors of our economy, and we are anticipating a rise on the levels of unemployment that could be at 50% or even more. And of course, the main fear is of everyone dying from COVID-19. What we have also been faced with has been the challenge of enough personal protective equipment, particularly for frontline workers, your health workers who have now been victims of contracting the virus. And also what we have seen, I think piggybacking from what Shawna have raised, is the face of COVID-19. Initially, when COVID-19 started, you know, in Europe, in Asia, it had no face because it was always the upper class that have been the ones that were contracting the virus. But as soon as it came into the working class and the poorest of the poor, it started to have a face. And you would see on TV that it would be the majority of the population in a country. In South African context, it will be your black poorest communities that now have become the face of COVID-19. But indeed, we must say as COSATU that despite all these challenges, South African government, has also tried to put in measures to combat the virus and also to try and cushion the poor and the working class from absolute poverty. The government has now allocated 40 billion of rands from the Unemployment Insurance Fund to help workers who have been retrenched or who are now unable to get their wages. But also we must say that the other challenge, despite the 40 billion rands that have been allocated by government to cushion workers, is the non-compliance of employers. Most employers are not applying for this relief on behalf of their employees. Some choose not to and take the simple route and the shortest route to retrench workers instead of applying for the relief. And also the banks and some financial service providers have also given payment holidays. What we have also seen in relation to government is the increase in social grants, and also for those that have been outside the employment, who others have lost hope in finding jobs, that they were also given some social grant to minimize the impact of the virus on them, so that they can be able to at least be able to buy the basic needs. We have also introduced long-term unemployment benefit that I've spoken to, and also provided some relief to some small, medium enterprises and companies. As a labor federation, COSATU, and other trade union federations at the level of NEDLEC, where South Africa, we negotiate legislation, we have a social dialogue where government, business constituency and labor constituency, including the social, our own non-profit organizations are also meeting with us there. We have now come up and engaged at that level to come up with alternatives in trying to cushion the blow, but also COSATU has been in engagements in regards to our Alliance Political Council. As you would know, that the Federation is in alliance with the ruling party, the African National Congress. So at that political level, we have also made some inroads in trying to push for some key economic interventions, and also meeting with the ministers that are relevant, your Minister of Employment and Labor in particular. And what we have ensured as a federation is to ensure that every month, every day in the morning at 9 o'clock, we do have a session with the Minister of Labor to also deal with day-to-day issues that are confronting workers, and be able to get responses on a day-to-day basis, and try our level best to see that there is also compliance with regards to the workplaces. What we have also agreed to is the reopening of the economy. You would know that from the 1st of May, as we were commemorating the May Day, South Africa was now getting into a different stage, which we are calling level 4 of the lockdown, where we started also to reopen some sectors of the economy. In that, what we have said as a federation and other sister federations is that when we start reopening the economy, we must ensure that all employers are adhering to health and safety plans, and they must produce those plans. We must ensure that there is a safe transport for workers. Too, in adhering to social distancing, we have also said that for those places that of work that would not have had shift patterns, they must now start to introduce shift work patterns, so that we are able to adhere to the social distancing. But also we have encouraged that for those that are able to work at home, should continue to do that. Critically and importantly is the issue of screening and testing for workers and consumers. And we must say that we have seen, as we are going to shopping malls and retail sectors, that wearing a mask now in South Africa has become a compulsory issue, that you would not leave home without wearing that mask. But we must say that what we have also seen, as Shawna have alluded to, is non-compliance of employers. Just before we started this session, I've received an SMS of employees in one workplace who are saying that one of their colleagues have tested positive of COVID-19. He has been sent home, but it continued to work as normal. No work, there was no stoppage of work, there was no sanitization of the workplace. So employers are also now more worried about driving profitability of their businesses than ensuring that as you do that, in the absence of workers that are safe from COVID-19, you are not going to be able to even take that company forward. So those are the issues that South African workers are currently faced with. But what we have also said as a federation, and also as we are commemorating the Workers' Day, is that as we reopen, we have said to our government that whilst we are putting relief measures for a number of employments, we must ensure that we strike a balance. Workers at this stage cannot be minus of a balance sheet of a company, you know. So when a relief or a stimulus fund is given to a company, there must be conditions that if we are to bail out your company, conditions are that you are not going to retrench workers, because we think that it cannot be that employers are going to be receiving these stimulus plans and stimulus funds from government that are derived from the tax revenue base that workers have been contributing, and you have massive retrenchments following that. So we said we must be able to strike that balance, that as government is going to be giving relief funds to a number of companies, it must be a condition that moratorium on retrenchments by those that are going to be given that relief funds are going to be adhered to. But we also think that it is a responsibility of both government and the private sector also, particularly the private sector, that we think has not necessarily made such efforts in coming forward to also double, if they were, the stimulus fund that government has managed to secure. We think that for us to be able to generate our economy, we need at least 1 trillion rands. Currently, government has managed to be raising funds of about 500 billion rands, but we think that with the private sector, particularly the financial sector, they must now be able also to come to the party. So we think that as a federation, we still have a lot of work to do. And I think, as Shawna have said, that this COVID-19 for us has indeed said to ourselves as a trade union, you know, the celebrities that needs to be celebrated are the ordinary workers. It has proven that, because as we were dealing with the essential sectors and essential services, we have now realized that those workers that are earning the lowest wage in our country, your farm workers, your domestic workers, your retail workers, your informal workers that are in the informal sector, are the ones that now have been seen to be essential during COVID-19, because all of us have relied on their existence for them to be able to make us to continue to live. And we think that that becomes an advantage presented by COVID-19 for us to be able to think of different labor laws and how we're going to turn around the situation to the advantage of ourselves as workers and the working class in our economies. And we think that we should be able to continue to monitor and see that there is compliance, but most importantly is to ensure that in as much as we appreciate that COVID-19 has taken us 100 steps forward in relation to the introduction of the 4th industrial revolution, but we think that we need to take advantage of that situation and say that with that, how are we going to remain relevant as a federation and as a trade union movement moving forward and defining a new normal in our economies? Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much. I think once again, you know, I think COSATU has much to teach, I think, the rest of the world about approaches that the labor movement can take. Fascinating comments. Before our next speaker, I want to remind our participants that you can put questions in the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll get to those after our next speaker. But I do want to turn now to our next speaker, Kalpona Akter, who's going to provide a perspective from Bangladesh. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. So the situation in Bangladesh, you know, this COVID-19 pandemic really heated our workers, just not only the supply chain worker and also workers, those are working in every sector. That includes day labor, domestic worker, dockyard workers, any other industrial workers. Everyone is facing the crisis. And the two most important crises that we are being facing, which has been our worker being facing, one is economic crisis or economic unsafety, not economical safety, and the second is the health issues. So soon this pandemic heated the world. This has heated our supply chain worker in here as well. Like the brand and retailers started canceling their orders, and then in the same time, the factories started retrenching the workers and laid off. And you know, the consequences is very practical for our workers. No job means no money, and no money means no food. So it is that practical, because workers are so hand to mouth. They live the average wages that supply chain workers, especially the garment worker, receiving in here, it is $115 to $120. And it is not enough for you know, a person with 2 kids in the family. It is so difficult for them to live with that money. And here we are not just sitting down from the labor movement. We are fighting like it is unlikely from any other time. We came together and we are fighting together with the government, with the manufacturers. We start fighting first, considering workers' health and safety issue. We demanded to shut down the factories, because that was really, really necessary during that time. And why we did so? We know that, you know, the economy needs to be run, but in the same time, our workers need to be alive as well. So we demanded to shut the factory because the country wasn't ready with all the hospital and medical facilities that the citizen needs and also the workers needs. Not these, the manufacturers had any backup plan for our workers economically and healthcare wise as well. So that was our first demand. Then, yeah, factory went closed. In the first hand, not all of them. Gradually, yes, many of them has been closed. Then the second negotiate, we started with our government and manufacturers that not trans any workers, and we really don't agree with any layoff to any industry or any factories that is that garment to any other factories that we have in the country. And our demand was very clear, because meanwhile, the government has been declared a bailout for the manufacturers. So it is, you know, there is a different bailout for export-oriented factories and, you know, non-export factories and also SMEs. So there was a money, but, you know, the factories is still just retrenching the workers, and also they were continuing their layoff. Then we started to negotiate that, no, you cannot do that. We wrote to the government, you know, there is a provision of labor law, which is called 324. We asked the government to apply that. So if our government apply that, then factory will be not able to, you know, terminate, dismiss, or fire any worker for any reason during this, you know, a certain time. We demanded that for at least 6 months or more, as long as this pandemic goes. And, you know, it is you know, really unlikely that we found that at least one response that our government did, that they said, you know, there is a bailout money, though it was not like a incentive, it's a low interest loan. So the government said the factories, those are doing the layoff, they will be not get access to this fund. You know, that worked really as a magic. And I would consider that's a, you know, achievement of labor movement that we did during this pandemic. And, you know, then the manufacturers start with another tricky thing. They came with another demand that, okay, we'll be paying workers only 60% of their wages for month of April. While the many of the manufacturers, like over 400 of them, did not pay workers wages for month of March that they already worked, which is affecting at least 200,000 workers. They didn't receive their wages till now. So they are still in hunger. Their children are starving. So when manufacturers and government declared that they will be giving only 60% of wages, and we said no. We all, pretty much all labor movement came together and we started negotiating. And still today, we stick to this 100% wages demand that we really needed, because without 100% wages, our workers not able to live with. They need to pay their rents, they need to pay their grocery bills, and let alone the medical. Like if they infected, then what would happen? So we are still fighting with these, and we hope that will be win in some point, because our workers also want 100% wages. They are raising their voice, and we have their back. And in an international platform, we are also fighting. We're not just fighting in a national level. We are fighting with these brand and retailers. Those has been canceled the order, and we are working with global unions, industrial, ITUC, union, as well as the global NGOs like Green Cross Campaign, Workers Consortium, and Solidarity Center is there as well. We are fighting together to asking these brands to turn around, and that's due to raising our voice in both level, nationally and internationally. That works. In many brands had to turn around, like PBH from US, like the H&M from Europe. They had to turn around, but there are some irresponsible brands too. I'm sorry to say like that way, but that is the reality. Brands like Walmart, they just canceled and didn't give any promise. The brand like Gap, they didn't give any promise that, what would be happening to their worker. They didn't tell that whether they will be taking this product or not. We are the worker in the production country who made profit, these manufacturers as well as these brands. But when we need them most, they just left us alone. They left us in a starving, which is not done. These are the big mouth brands who always speak about corporate social responsibility, but when the Trump come to take their responsibility, they are just nowhere. But we will be not let them go alone without taking the responsibility. We definitely, keep fighting in a both level, in nationally and internationally. So this is, when we are fighting for our workers' economy security, in the other hand, our workers are facing the healthcare problem. They are facing their occupational safety and health problem. Meanwhile, there is over 50 garment workers got infected. 4 of them has been died. Yes, we have to agree with reopening this factory because we hadn't had any choice. The workers, they wanted to save their jobs when they have been threatened by these manufacturers that you need to come XYZ day, otherwise your job will be no longer with us. They had to come when even the country had a travel ban, when there wasn't any local transport. So they had to take that risk. But risking, when they wanted to save their job, but they risk their health. So, the worst may be coming more, but in the same time, we have demanded the factories, those has been reopened in every sector that include, the garment sector as well. They have to, keep the safety measures high in their factories while workers getting into the factory and also when they're working in the factory. We were, through our demand, we were, able to make every factory to put the thermal checkup, washing hand, giving mask, gloves, disinfecting the shows, and also, keep distance in the factory. Some of the factory even made 2 shifts, but still, as the nature of these factories, you cannot keep distance in between the worker. So when we're trying to getting all the safety measures, but in the same time, we have fear that our more worker will be getting infected, more workers' life will be in danger due to this virus. So we are closely monitoring these, and as soon as we will see any workers are getting sick, or in one factory or one workplace, if we see more than 1 or more than 5 workers are getting sick, we will be demanding that factory should be shut down for, a certain time. So our workers, we can give these workers a medical access through our country medical system to do this test. So at least we can understand that our workers are safe. So This is where we are now. But one thing, as I understood, I understood since I started fighting when I was 12, when I started work. So since then, one thing I really know that trade union is one of the way out for our workers to achieve our voice, to achieve our collective bargaining agreement, to achieve a safe workplace, to achieve our living wage, and also a safe, a gender-based violence-free workplace in here. So post-pandemic situation, I think will be in a more strong in organizing and as well as raising our voice for every other issues that we have been, I just mentioned. One thing, I know that there is so many bad things brought this virus, but one thing brought to my working life that I would say that unity in between the unions that I see is it is very, very new, and we are fighting together, and I will hope that we can keep that together for post-pandemic situation. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's an inspiring call that, this is an opportunity to come together to confront these challenges. I'm going to ask for a couple of comments from a couple of our friends from the Solidarity Center, John Hartow, the country director for Bangladesh, and Hanad Mohammed, former regional program director for Africa. John, do you have a couple of comments for us?
Sure. I think, first of all, thank you to Shawna and President Losi and Kalpona for their fantastic comments. I'll just say a couple of quick points. I think this crisis has indicated or forced people to recognize the significant cracks in the social safety net and the exploitation that's inherent in the capitalist system and the risks that there are to workers' health and safety, and the pressure that this has put on the whole system has exposed those cracks. And I think if you look back through history, a lot of the major organizing that's been done is on the back of major social upheaval, whether it's the Great Depression in the 1930s or the run-up to the war in the 1940s. You see millions of workers galvanized by that type of a crisis. And I'm hoping that this is an opportunity for folks in what we're calling the global South, but also here in this country, to rise up and start to organize, because this is a crisis, but it's also an opportunity. And I also think it's really important to understand that unions and global organizations that work on worker parity and worker rights, like Solidarity Center and Clean Clothes Campaign in Bangladesh and ILRF and some of the other organizations, we're really on the front lines as a check to global capital. And without the unions working with other NGOs and other organizations to push governments, to push brands, to push corporations to do the right thing, there's really no check on this. And you see, unfortunately, how much power brands and corporations have with governments and the nationalist system now. They're really driving the agenda. And unless there's a counter from the labor movement or some sort of check on that, I think we're in real trouble of significant exploitation, and I think it can get even worse. And so, if you look back, the labor movement in the United States is an example. If you look back over the last 60 years, our numbers have been declining, and it's almost like the pendulum needs to start to swing. And I'm hoping that this crisis will help us galvanize organizing, because it's really stark. This is a life and death situation for workers, right? Like Kalpona mentioned it, it's not just a choice between whether or not you want to go to work or stay home. You've got to go to work because you've got to be able to eat. And corporations and governments are taking advantage of that situation to push workers to work in unsafe conditions. And so the last point I'll make, it's indicative in Bangladesh. The country's still on lockdown. They're shut down. Stay-at-home in place orders are in place until the 16th of May, but the garment sector is still open. Why? It's the largest contributor to the Bangladesh economy. You've got a $30 billion industry, and without that, it's very difficult for the whole country to move. There's all kinds of indirect jobs that are impacted. There's all kinds of economic impacts there. But this is, like Kalpona mentioned, and like President Losi mentioned, this is an opportunity for labor unions, to get engaged on a global level with global union federations, with international finance corporations, with global corporations to really figure out a solution that works for workers and for regular working people. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Hannah, do you have a couple of comments as well?
Yes, sure, briefly. First of all, I also want to thank the panelists for their very valuable comments. I think one point to really highlight, I think that was common across all three panelists, is that the labor movement is not willing to go back to the old normal. There is a real desire and a willingness to create a new normal coming out of this pandemic. And that's not by accident. That is very grounded in a historical fact, which is that in many developing countries, the trade union movement was part of the independence struggle. They were part of establishing that nation's country's constitution, for example. Many of the social protection schemes or mechanisms that exist in many of the global South countries were contributed to by the trade union movement. So it's a very natural thing for the labor movement in the global South to say, we're going to be part and parcel of creating this new normal. We are going to change the social contract. We are going to use this opportunity to organize new workers and change terms and conditions of employment across industries and across our country. And I think in many cases, that's being done very directly by engaging with governments. In some cases, such as in the case of President Losi in South Africa, there's a strategic alliance that exists between the party in power and the labor movement, and using that mechanism of influence. In other places, it's a more confrontational relationship. But what I think is a very, where they have much in common in many of these global South countries, is that the labor movement sees itself as a very legitimate stakeholder in not only creating that country itself, bringing about independence, but also setting the terms and conditions of the social contract that exists, and at this moment in time, changing that social contract for the better.
Yeah, thanks. I'm now going to turn over to my colleague, Professor Dina Bishara, who's going to pass on some questions that we've received from participants and pose those to the panelists. Dina.
Great. Yeah, we've received quite a few, so I'll start with a couple. One question has to do with the extent to which the South African government's special employer and employee relief schemes have been sufficient and implemented well and fairly in practice, and if not, what we can learn from the problems of poor implementation. A similar question, I guess, about whether there are differences in the provisions and payments in various, sort of differences in layoffs and health and safety provisions and wage payments, and have industrial relations and social dialogue systems functioned in responding to the crisis, and the extent to which that's happened. I'll stop here, and then we can go for another round.
Should I come in?
Yes, please.
Oh, thank you very much. I'll try and summarize it, but I'm not sure whether all of them were meant for me. But I think in relation to this, in the South African context on the employer and employee relief scheme, we have always had the temporary relief employer and employee relief scheme, where if a company that is under distress would apply for government funding to take their employees on a training, perhaps if you were to put them on short time, but ensure that they do not get out of, or they do not lose their employment. So you keep on your employment whilst you are taking them on training and trying to rebuild your organization. Currently under COVID, as I've said earlier on, that the challenge that we had is that employers are no longer going for this route. The route has always been there. it has always worked wonderful before the COVID-19. But what we have seen is that employers have chosen a route of closing down or retrenching workers, putting COVID-19 as an excuse, but also taking a shortcut without engaging the trade unions in the workplace. So what we have done, as I've said, is that having picked up this, because what we have seen is out of the relief, 40 billion rands of a relief fund given by government, we have had a low intake of applications by employers on behalf of their employees. And when we then questioned the Department of Employment and Labor as to understand why, we have then realized that a number has risen on the normal unemployment insurance fund claims, which then suggests that employers are no longer using the relief fund, but have opted to put their workers on retrenchment without engagement of a trade union. But whilst everyone is focusing on this one, numbers are increasing in relation to the ordinary unemployment insurance fund. What we have said now, and this morning we're coming out of a meeting with the Minister of Employment and Labor, is that we want a list of those employers who are not adhering to the regulations, and we want them to be named and shamed. We want them to be published so that each and every worker and everyone must understand who are those that are hell-bent in ensuring that they are going to use this pandemic to exploit workers even further, and ensure that they do not come back on the system on a different name, having re-registered themselves under a different company, and only to come back and also undermine the very same gains that we have achieved as workers in relation to your wages in terms of what we have already negotiated. And what we are doing now is make sure that we do put monitoring systems in place. As I've said, that every day we continue to engage with the minister, relevant Minister of Employment and Labor, every morning at 9 o'clock, but also in relation to wages and health and safety and other regulations. What we have also ensured as trade unions in South Africa is that we also want, because as much as there is a 40 billion rands relief fund allocated by government on the issue of unemployment for workers, there is also 100 billion rands that is given as a relief to small, medium enterprises. What we have said to the ministries involved is that we want to see a working relation and a synergy between the two, so that employers do not take the 100 billion, or not necessarily that each employer will get 100 billion, but they do not tap into that fund of a relief scheme and at the same time continue to retrench workers. So the money that is used under the UIF and the TERS fund must also find expression in relation to the number of companies that are receiving the fund to rescue their businesses on the other hand. So what we are calling for and what we are monitoring as a federation and trade unions in South Africa is to ensure that compliance and working synergy amongst the departments finds expression, and that at the center of it, the expression of workers' rights must always be emphasized at all levels, be it in relation to their wages, be it in relation to health and safety, be it to the informal economy, and also, as Shawna have said, talked about the migrant labor, because currently they are finding themselves not part of the relief schemes, and also perhaps not even benefiting from their own governments. So how are we going to find the balance in ensuring that they do not fall between the cracks? And these are the issues that we are waging as trade unions in South Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Kalpona, did you want to add to that? There's also a couple of questions that were directed specifically at Bangladesh as well. You're muted, I think.
Will you just repeat the question? I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, there was a few questions. One having to do with the differences in sort of between the union and non-union enterprises, and in terms of the relief they're getting, and also there have been also a couple of questions about how different parts of the labor movement, local federation and NGOs and global union federations have responded to protests by the garment workers in Bangladesh. Just a final question about Bangladesh, asking if, assuming that the government stimulus package is not enough for all workers in Bangladesh, do you have any plan to get the stimulus extended by the global brands? And is there any way to legally hold the retailers accountable? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll be, start with the last one. Yeah, the bailout package that has been announced by the government definitely is not enough for workers if this pandemic goes for a longer period of time. We demanding, and we are working with the global unions, and ILO, ITUC also there, and our global federation industrial negotiating with the employers, IOE, in an agreement that where it is two important things are there. One, definitely, a whole supply chain worker should be covered in that agreement. The brands, those has been canceled the order, they should come back and do the payment. So factory has money to pay workers. And for longer period of time, we are demanding to bring a secure financial package for workers, not only in Bangladesh, also for every production country workers, those are being affected by this COVID-19. So this is one we are working in, and there is no doubt without international financial support, it would be difficult for us to, our workers to survive in the coming days, or as this pandemic goes longer time. But in the same time, I wanted to criticize our manufacturers as well. This industry is not started in Bangladesh for 5 years. It is 3 decades, this industry is in here. But these manufacturers haven't had any financial plan or backup plan for workers. They should have a backup plan that how they will be paying their workers at least for a month or two if this pandemic goes, or if for a longer time. None of them. Soon as this pandemic started, soon the brand is started canceling the order. Everyone just crying and saying, "Oh, we don't have money to pay workers." This should not be done. This should not be done for any industry or any country. That the workers will be working for the factories for a long time. But when any pandemic or any crisis comes, the manufacturers will just up their hands and say, "We don't have money to pay you." Well, I mean, this is a bigger criticism should go to these manufacturers. So this is one response that I have, and other. Okay, so yeah, I mean, our country is one of the challenging country. We face union busting pretty much all the time, and but this time, we've in the factory level union really facing a lot of crisis. But in a national level, we are trying to coming together and fighting together. And to the answer to the question, the workers, those are protesting for their wages. What is the response from global and local level from the NGOs and unions? We keep writing our government. We are negotiating with like DIFE, Ministry of Labor. We are negotiating with the manufacturers to pay the workers soon as possible. So these are the factory who are subcontract factory, not a direct exporters. So that is one of the bigger challenges that we are being facing, that the factory says, I'm not a direct supplier and I cannot pay at this moment, but we are bringing them to the DIFE. DIFE is the factory inspectors who's supposed to take care of workers' wages and everything in terms of monitoring. So we are including this DIFE to taking care, and we are including the Manufacturers Association also do the negotiation with the individual factory and pay workers soon as possible, or bring them in the bailout, under the bailout money scheme.
Dina, can I just make a quick
Absolutely.
point? To the question about the standards, are they different between unionized and non-unionized plants? You can actually take that globally. what we get is you get the same group of global brands, a couple hundred of them, sourcing from a variety of different countries. And if you happen to be a worker who, out of luck, is born and living in a country where your government has strong regulations, social protections, and all that, then your conditions are one thing. If you happen to be a worker that's living in a country where your government is more interested in the direct, foreign direct investment, and maybe half of the manufacturers or members of parliament are related to the president or whatever, and there's corruption, then you're up a creek. And it's the same global brands sourcing, just different conditions in different countries. This really raises a very important question about how we have organized the global economy. It's kind of existential when you think about also climate change and the future of work and the kinds of transitions that are going to need to happen across global supply chains over the next 50 years. The idea that I'm a global company and I'm making decisions based solely on shareholder profit for my company, and I happen to be based probably in a particular country, let's say in Europe, that I might even be getting a bailout, but I'm making decisions that are affecting the lives of hundreds of thousands of workers globally. And if they're lucky enough to be in a country where their government has put aside money for unemployment insurance, they're fine. If they happen to live in a country with, I have no responsibility, I'm just, based wherever in Sweden, or I'm just in the US, not my problem. It's a complete fallacy of the global system. These workers and these supply chains, food supply chains, electronics, export manufacturing, clothing production, are essential workers always to lead firms. And the idea that we define essential worker solely based on a country context and not across global supply chains, and that these brands are sourcing in countries for decades. So over decades that they have not solved the problem in their own supply chain of things like health and safety standards, making sure that money is put aside in unemployment insurance, making sure layoff protections are present, and at a bare minimum, allowing for freedom of association and worker representation. But the truth is that isn't standard across the global supply chains, because it isn't committed to or regulated internationally. And that's just something we got to throw up in the air and say, we can't actually function this way. All of our health security is deeply interconnected across the world. One person gets sick in New York, somebody's going to get sick in South Africa. If someone gets sick in Bangladesh, someone in France is going to get sick. We are interconnected, and the global economy is interconnected, and the brands can't have it both ways. And the global the global companies, on the one hand, total freedom for wherever they want to invest, and on the other hand, zero responsibility for what happens to workers in the supply chains in a crisis like this. You can't have it both ways in the next 50 years with climate change, just transition, and future of work, let alone in another pandemic like this. And we need to just challenge that system now. We can't just go back to what we've been doing. We need to challenge that entire system differently.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think there's also a broader question that I'm going to direct to all of the panelists about how unions are navigating the challenges brought about by the pandemic, where in countries where the right to collective bargaining is not provided or is not guaranteed. And then, let's go with that question if all the panelists want to respond, since it's a big one.
Yeah, I mean, it is definitely difficult. Country like us, we do have right. We do have right to organize. We do have right to bargain, but we're just not free to, because the country we are in some cases, our legislator is our factory owner. I know it is so difficult to fight, but in the same time, we and our young workers, we are courageous too. If they push us to back, we know how to push us in the front. So we are facing all this retaliation when we try to organize, when we try to bargain, but we know how to overcome, in the same time, we know how to overcome that and come back again and to keep fighting. We are in a situation that if we raise our voice, if we say anything in Facebook that our voice need to be paid, we know the second call we'll be getting from the intelligence. But we also know that we have to keep fighting in this dire situation, and we have to win. And how we are doing that? Because one, I definitely say that our workers are courageous. We do have that courage to keep fighting, but in the same time, we know that global community, the unions, global unions, and global NGOs and consumers, everyone is watching. Everyone is watching what's happening in here. And every time when we face a problem, we know that global community have our back in some cases. So that given us, us courage to keep fighting. I know that, there are more dire situations in many countries that even they cannot raise voices. But this is what I can say, at this moment. But, we will try to make this change in a post-pandemic situation, bring back us in a stronger position.
Thank you. Any other, President Losi or, yes.
Thank you very much. I think in the South African context, because we have a right to organize and a right to collective bargaining, a right to strike, we are really not have had any challenges pertaining to that. But what we have done using COVID-19 is to strengthen those collective bargaining rights and, to use the advantage of COVID-19. For an example, the clothing and textile industry, that sector for us has had numerous opportunities, and they have used those opportunities at their own advantage. One, to negotiate at their collective bargaining council for better conditions. Two, for better procurement. Currently, I was just looking now that they've just reached 14 million fabric face mask manufacturing capacity per week. And what we have done, strengthening those collective bargaining, is to also use our advantages. I've said that the Federation, COSATU, is in alliance with the ANC, but also at the level of NETLEC, where social dialogue takes place of all social partners, is to put to the government and the business that any procurement that is to take place has to be a local procurement first. We have always said that South Africans must consume what they produce and produce what they consume. So if we are to deal with getting out of the COVID-19 economic crisis, it can only be South Africans doing it firstly for their own. And everyone have said we have a weak rand, but we've said it is an advantage for the domestic economy to be able to build that domestic economy, but also ensuring that jobs are going to be created. And that for us puts us at an opportunity to now be the players and the firm players in the game, but also be at the table to say, how are we going to craft the rules? And we have always put it and said, we are not just going to be stakeholders as we are normally defined, literally holding the stake and allowing everyone else to eat, but we are going to be the players in the game. And what we have said as South African workers is that using the COVID-19 pandemic and the crisis that our economy is at, our voice now has become even more louder in ensuring that anything and any legislation that is being crafted now or amended has a voice of workers in it, be it at the sectoral level or at the national level, at the policy level. Thank you very much.
I would just add that a reminder that, labor rights are the most frequently violated set of human rights on earth. So to the question about what's going on in where there isn't strong collective bargaining, around 80% of countries limit or restrict collective bargaining either in the public sector or in the informal sector or for agricultural workers or for huge categories of workers like domestic workers and others. Like 90% of countries ban or severely limit the right to strike. freedom of association and the right to have unions at all is barred in many countries, but is severely limited in the majority of countries. So labor rights are the most frequently violated set of human rights on earth. And that is before the pandemic. And that is before we have 84 countries or so limiting civil liberties and civil rights by extending these vast new government powers around human rights in a pandemic. And that's before the new rise of global authoritarianism and the huge upsurge in employer like strong arm behavior undermining unions, etc. Labor rights are the most frequently violated set of human rights. And that is why, that is one of the reasons why we have weak collective bargaining, why we don't have the collective power everywhere we should have. But that needs to be one of the core things we come out of this pandemic with, because without the right to speak, the right to organize, the right to bargain, and the right to fight, we are not going to come out of this stronger. We will come out of this flat or weaker, and we will not be able to create the kind of future and vision that we all know we need for all workers. And so I just want to throw out there that this needs to be what we throw down on, these fundamental human rights of workers, 150 years of the global labor movement. These are the rights we have fought for and won. They're under attack everywhere, and we need to stand up against that.
Great, thank you so much. We have a few other questions, but I'm not sure if we have time for them. So I'm gonna quickly summarize them, and I'm not sure. Yeah, so one has to do with just a specific example. If you can give about Bangladesh and the cooperation with industrial, like a concrete example of the help you were able to get. A general question about whether manufacturing countries can ensure adequate social safety nets for workers while having to compete for the cheapest prices to attract foreign brands. And then finally, a broader question about whether we see this as whether we see efforts in the global South capitalizing on this opportunity to do more organizing. And I don't think we have a lot of time, but maybe just if anybody wants to jump in on those questions for maybe a minute or so.
What was the question for achieving global agreement? I'm sorry. The very first one you said?
The first one was about you mentioned that you were able to get help from international labor organizations like Industrial, and whether you can give a concrete example of the kind of help they gave and how that worked out. The result.
I mean, if we talk about now, then it is difficult to precise one of that because we are bargaining. But if we go back, I mean, the Industrial Global Union was involved to have to sign on the global agreement, which is called Accord on Bangladesh Fire and Building Safety. Though, you know, there are more stakeholders was on it, like Clean Clothes Campaign, in the International Labor Rights Forum, Workers Consortium, Aquila Solidarity Network, Uni Global, but Industrial Global Union was one of the part who was, you know, driving in the seat to have that agreement to be signed with global companies and with the global union and local union. And it was on safety. It was in a post-Rana, you know, situation that has been signed, and that has made a phenomenal change here in the country. So this is one we definitely can say. But on the other hand, one other negotiation happening at this moment, we really don't know that where that will take us. But this is what I can put in place now.
Great, thank you. I'll hand it over to Dean Colvin, as I'm not sure if we have enough remaining time, but he might be able to direct any final thoughts.
Sure. Yes, we are running up against the end of our time, so I do want to just finish off by thanking our participants in this webinar. I think what we're trying to do here is through putting together a global panel and a global discussion, embody what I think is a key lesson that we've heard from our participants' comments, that we're dealing with one of the classic tensions of of globalization, that, economic activity has globalized. We see over the course of labor history that tension as economic activity globalizes, can labor rights expand in conjunction with that. Labor acts locally and needs to act locally, but as trade and economic activity becomes global, we also need to have global labor rights, and global solidarity has to support local action. We've seen that in many contexts over the years. Obviously in South Africa, in the days of apartheid, local action and global solidarity were key together. But I think we see today, again, in some of the issues on global value chains, certainly in Bangladesh, the issues there in relation to global brands that we're all dealing with, that we deal with as consumers around the world, but recognizing that labor rights have to flow with those global value chains as an essential principle. And now in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, that we need to make sure that there's global recognition of labor rights and the interests of labor in the responses that are being made to COVID-19 and dealing with a pandemic that's affecting us all. And so we need to be concerned about all of the workers' labor rights across the globe in the response to that. So we've got a lot of important points that have been raised today. I think they'll be sparking a lot of thoughts in all of our heads, and I hope that will spark continued dialogue and interaction. And just to again finish off by thanking our panelists, Shawna Bader-Blau, President Losi, and Kalpona Akter. Thank you very much for your comments. Really appreciate it. And thanks to all the attendees, participants for joining us today. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.